All right, so we're going to wrap up the scientific revolution with two smaller topics that need to be discussed here. The first is kind of opposition to science. And the main opponent of science was the church. The church opposed most of the scientific work being done in Europe. Not necessarily because they disliked science, but they disliked the growing secularization of European society. European society and culture. So, in some cases, it was the science. Like when we're talking about astronomy, they really didn't like astronomy. But they really didn't like, in general, the growing secular nature of European culture. And science was kind of uh, drawing people away from the church. So, like every time that a scientist every time a scientist disproved a medieval scientific, and I'll put that in quotation marks, a medieval scientific idea that the church believed in, it makes the church look even more foolish. So, science in general is something that the church is opposing. Sometimes specific things like astronomy, they really don't like astronomy, but in general, every time that a scientist is disproving something, it makes the church look bad, and the church doesn't like to look bad. And this is just a long series of setbacks for the church that go all the way back to like the Renaissance. So, this growing secularization kind of starts with the Renaissance. And then it moves into like the political ideas of the Reformation. And then that leads into the Peace of Westphalia. And so by the time we get to like the 1700s, and we're dealing with guys like Newton, the church is already being knocked back on its heels on many, many fronts. On a political front with the Reformation and the Peace of Westphalia, on a cultural front with science. The church is being, it seems like, to the church's point of view, it seems like the church is being attacked on all sides, and it just generally opposes the idea of science. Now, there were some philosophers that attempted to reconcile science, no, reconcile science with Christianity. So there were a couple of scientists or philosophers that attempted to kind of bridge the gap between science and Christianity. The first one of these is a guy named Baruch Spinoza. And he puts forward a theory that's known as pantheism. He doesn't come up with this, but he's a big proponent of pantheism. Pantheism is the idea that God is everywhere and everything. So for a pantheist, if you study science, you're really studying God. If you learn math, you're learning God's language. That's how God communicates with us. So really, by studying science, you're studying God. And this is kind of an extension of humanism. If this is the world that God has created, wouldn't God want us to study it? Isn't that the point of free will, is to study what God has put in front of us? That should make God happy. So all of these ideas that Spinoza is putting out seems to put science and religion together. That it's okay to study science because that's what God wanted us to do. If God didn't want us to study science, he wouldn't have given us the free will to do so. There's another guy, and he kind of takes a more kind of sinister path to reconciling science and religion. And this guy is named Blaise Pascal. Now, you might know this guy from math class because he was a mathematician, and you might recognize Pascal's triangle. He's the triangle guy. But for us, we're going to talk about two things that Pascal argued. The first one is called Pascal's Wager. Basically, Pascal's wager is this. You can do two things. You can either believe in God or not believe in God. If you believe in God and you're right, you get heaven. If you believe in God and you're wrong, nothing happens. If you choose not to believe in God and you're right, nothing happens. But if you believe in God, if you don't believe in God and you're wrong, you get hell. So looking at this like a scientist would, looking at this logically, the correct option is to believe in God, because this gives you the best possible outcome and the second best possible outcome. Not believing in God gives you the second best outcome and the worst outcome. So it just makes sense to believe in God. The problem with Pascal's wager is that it defeats the purpose of faith. If you're believing in God because of logic, then that's not the reason you should be believing in God. So that's one aspect of this. So Pascal's wager is this idea that logically speaking, you should believe in God. But kind of counterintuitively, that belief in God actually defeats the whole purpose of believing in God. The other thing about Pascal is that he's trying to view Christianity, like he is with his wager, through a lens of logic and reason to appeal to scientists or the educated. And he basically argues that people are sinners and are born into a world of sin and deceit. And that makes us much more likely to reject God. So the world we live in is bad, we're bad, and that's going to make us worse. So the world we live in is one in which we're designed to reject God. And so we just continue to deceive ourselves until we realize that God is the truth. He also kind of argues that science will only take us so far. And the missing piece of the puzzle is God. Now, again, a lot of this kind of logic, again, kind of defeats the purpose of faith. And this idea of people being just awful is something that it's kind of a new idea, because we've kind of been saying all along that, like, God has made us very nice. God has made us in his image. And so the idea that we're awful kind of flies in the face of the ideas of humanism and the Renaissance. But some of these ideas, Pascal is kind of a nice segue into some of the ideas of the Enlightenment, because these ideas are going to influence some of the Enlightenment figures we'll turn to in our next set of videos. The last thing that I want to address, the last small topic, is how science was used by the government. So eventually, governments start to realize that science can be helpful to them. And as we've kind of already noted, a lot of these monarchs, a lot of these governments are in Northern Europe. where the church has less influence. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about right here is going to be in England and the Netherlands, but also France, because the church in France has a little more independence from the Catholic Church because of their ability to choose their own bishops. So the church in France is a little bit more independent than the normal Catholic Church, and we've mentioned that before. So we're going to see most of this stuff happening in Northern Europe. So a lot of this stuff happens for a lot of the science that is promoted has practical implications. So, for example, in France, there was make sure I get this right, the French Academy of Sciences, which was founded by Louis XIV. They would focus on things with like military applications or economic applications. The one in England is just known as the Royal Society, which was at one point led by Isaac Newton, among other things that Newton did during his life. They were more independent and kind of did science for science's sake. But there was still the idea that science needed to have applications. But eventually the government is going to start to get in on this science stuff and use it for their own ends. Okay, so we're now done kind of talking about the scientific revolution. So just to kind of wrap up, why did science spread? It had opposition. So why is science spreading? For one, this was something for educated people and rich people. And just like today, when rich people or smart people latch onto something, it spreads. So think of these people as like early influencers. When rich people do something, other people are going to take notice. When the educated people start doing something, people are going to take notice of it. And a lot of these rich, educated people used science to make money. So a lot of the interest in science was to make money off of, agricultural innovations, or new inventions or cheaper production methods. And again, once something is seen to make money, people are going to flock to it. There were also all of these political applications, primarily in terms of the military. So the government liked science because it could make their military better. And to a smaller degree, there was a little bit of acceptance of science by religious reformers. And this is going to sound really counterintuitive, but the idea is that science could better society for Jesus's return. And the idea was that the Reformation had caused a lot of anxiety, and everybody thought the world was about to end. And so everybody was like, we got to clean up before Jesus comes back, and science might help us clean up faster. So there was a very small number of people who were religious that liked science, but not for the reasons you might think, but because it might make the world look better for when Jesus comes back. All right, I'm going to stop there. This is the last video on the scientific revolution. Our next video will start our series on the Enlightenment, and we're going to see a lot of carryover from the scientific revolution into the Enlightenment. And we're also going to see a lot of carryover from the Renaissance and the Reformation. So this is all kind of one long intellectual process that starts with the Renaissance and kind of continues through the Enlightenment into kind of the period of nationalism and the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. So this is kind of a one long intellectual journey that we're on, and we're just kind of in the middle of it now with the Enlightenment, which is where we'll turn to in our next video. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.